Yeah? Okay. Here's my confession. I used to think women's rights were basically a Western invention. Suffragettes, protests, all that fire. And then somebody slapped a primary source document in front of me that rewrote everything I thought I knew. I've been chasing this story for months, and honestly, I'm still not over it. Let me take you somewhere. Not Paris, not London, not Rome, the Visayas, the 1300s. A chief named 𝗪𝗓𝗪𝗀 is sitting down with a council of elders on the island of Panay. They're not discussing war. They're not dividing land. They're writing law, specific, careful, deliberate law about what a woman can own, inherit, and walk away from. While Europe is still figuring out that kings maybe shouldn't have absolute power over every breathing soul in the kingdom. This is the Maragtas Code, and the moment you actually look at what's inside it, something shifts. You realize the story of women's rights doesn't start where you were told it starts. The Maragtas Code is old. Scholars debate exactly how old, and that debate matters. We'll get there. But the tradition it comes from is ancient, deep-rooted, baked into the bones of Visayan culture long before Spanish ships appeared on the horizon. What 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗪𝗀's council codified wasn't revolutionary to them. It was normal. It was the water they swam in. Women in pre-colonial Philippine society across Luzon, the Visayas, Mindanao, held property, real property, land, tools, goods, livestock, not borrowed from a husband, not granted by a father. Theirs. When a marriage ended, a woman walked away with what was hers coming in. She also walked away with half of what the couple built together. Let that sit for a second. Half by law, not by charity. In 14th century England, a woman's legal identity disappeared the moment she married, swallowed whole into her husband's. She couldn't own property in her name, sign contracts, or sue anyone in court. She basically became a legal extension of the man. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215, was a massive deal, but read it closely. The rights in that document were for barons, not women, not commoners. Barons. So when people talk about ancient rights, ancient protections, the story is never as clean as we learned. You know, and here's the thing that keeps itching at me. The Maragtas Code wasn't even the only one. There's another document, older, more complete, more jaw-dropping in scope. The Code of 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪, attributed to a Visayan chief named 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪, supposedly written around 1433. For decades, Filipino schools taught this as the oldest written legal code in Philippine history. Museums displayed it, textbooks enshrined it. Then came the argument. In the mid-20th century, historian William Henry Scott, a careful, rigorous man, looked closely at the Code of 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪. Really looked, and he concluded it was almost certainly a fabrication written by 𝗪𝗄𝗎. Marco in the early 1900s, not the 1400s. A forgery. A beautiful, elaborate, nationally significant forgery. The Philippine historical community did not take this quietly. Precisely quietly. Some scholars accepted Scott's findings. Well, others pushed back hard. The debate has never fully closed, and honestly, that unresolved tension is worth sitting with rather than pretending there's a clean answer. But here's what Scott's critique didn't touch. Stop. Think about what was never disputed. The underlying social practices, the actual lived reality of Filipino women before colonization. Those weren't invented by any document. They were recorded by the Spanish themselves when they arrived. Conquistadors, missionaries, colonial administrators wrote about what they found with something between confusion and alarm. Miguel de Loarca, Antonio de Morga, Pedro Chirino. These men wrote accounts of Philippine society in the 1500s and early 1600s. And they described, repeatedly, women who traded in markets independently, truly independently. Women who served as religious leaders, the 𝗵𝗶𝗵𝗵𝗀, the 𝗪𝗏𝗀, commanding enormous spiritual authority. Women who could divorce, women who retained their own property and identity within marriage. On the other hand, the Spaniards weren't celebrating this. They were trying to understand it, and then, over the next 3 centuries, systematically dismantle it. Because what they found didn't fit their framework at all. 𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗀 wasn't a priest's assistant. She was the priest? Well, the healer, the bridge between the living and the dead. In some communities, the most powerful figure in the village, more influential than the datu in spiritual matters, was a woman, or sometimes a man who embodied feminine spiritual energy. The role itself was fluid in ways that even contemporary Western thought is still catching up with. Colonization didn't just change laws. It changed what was imaginable. The Spanish introduced the concept of the good woman, shaped by Catholic doctrine, silent, subordinate, defined through her relationship to husband and church. They pushed the Babylon underground, literally. Women who practiced the old ways were labeled as threats to the social order. Some were killed, many went quiet. The knowledge went into hiding and survived in fragments, in folk practices, in half-remembered rituals that Filipinos still perform without always knowing where they came from. That erasure was patient, well, generational, and effective, which is exactly why the Maragtas Code matters so much, not just as a legal document, but as a mirror. It reflects a society where women's legal protections weren't an afterthought. They were foundational. Women in pre-colonial Philippine society could be witnesses in legal proceedings. Their testimony carried weight. A woman who was wronged had recourse, not through a male guardian's petition, but her own. Bride price, called 𝗤𝗍𝗪, wasn't payment for the woman herself. It was an economic exchange between families, and the woman had say in whether she accepted it. Say. In a 14th century legal tradition, voluntary consent embedded in the practice. Meanwhile, in 14th century Europe, canon law was actively debating whether a woman could refuse a marriage arranged by her father. The debate wasn't settled cleanly until much later, and even then, settled was generous. You know, this isn't about making the pre-colonial Philippines sound like paradise. It wasn't. There was slavery, debt slavery, war slavery, status-based hierarchy that could be brutal. Datus held enormous power. Class structures were real and rigid in their own ways. You know, the idea of a perfectly egalitarian pre-colonial golden age is a myth just as much as the idea that rights were invented in the West. But the specific documented legal protections for women? Those were real, recorded by enemies of the culture who had every reason to minimize them. Preserved in oral tradition, in the Boxer Codex, in Spanish colonial records written with obvious discomfort at what they found. You don't need to romanticize it to recognize what it was. Here's what breaks my heart a little. Most Filipinos today don't know this, not because the information doesn't exist. It does. It's in archives, in academic papers, in the work of historians like Jesús Salazar, who spent decades trying to reconstruct pre-colonial Filipino identity through a framework he called Pantayong Pananaw, looking at history from the inside out, not the outside in. The problem is what got emphasized, what got taught, what got celebrated in textbooks, shaped by colonial and post-colonial priorities. Think about it. The narrative was reset, and the reset pushed the starting line to 1521. Magellan, the cross in Cebu. As if nothing significant existed before a European set foot on the shore and decided to name it. Generation after generation grew up not knowing that their ancestors had already written law, already protected women, already built sophisticated, layered, spiritually complex societies with their own internal logic and their own hard-won wisdom. That's not just a historical footnote. That's an identity wound, and the healing of that wound, at least part of it, is exactly this. Looking back, not with nostalgia, not with the fantasy of a lost paradise, but with clear eyes and genuine curiosity. The Maragtas Code, whatever its exact dating controversies, points to something documentable and real. A legal culture that placed women's rights inside the architecture of society, not on the margins of it. A culture where a woman's voice in a legal proceeding was not a scandal. Where a woman walking away from a bad marriage with her property intact was not rebellion, it was the law. 800 years before the feminist movement found its vocabulary. Moving on. 800 years before the international conventions and the UN resolutions and the global summits on gender equality. Incidentally, the concept already existed, right here. In this archipelago, in the mouths and minds of people who left no statues, no grand cathedrals, no names carved in stone, in ways that Western historical frameworks learn to recognize and respect. Maybe the hardest thing about this isn't the history itself. There's a catch. Maybe it's the quiet realization that some things don't need to be invented. They need to be remembered.